Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's program. My name is Chelsea Oliver, and I'm the Director of Marketing and Community Engagement here at the JES. So it is my pleasure to kick off tonight's event, and I have 3 jobs this evening. So the first will be some housekeeping, second, some upcoming events, and then third, introducing our presenter. So first, housekeeping. If you need some assistance during the event, I will be hanging out in the back, and so will our intern Bailey. If you need us, just wave us down. For the Q&A, we ask that you wait for the microphone to come to you. Raise your hand, wait for the mic, and then please form your question as a question and not a lengthy statement. For some upcoming events, tomorrow at noon on Zoom, our newest Ramey Fellow, Sarah McCall, will present the role of public libraries in addressing the loneliness crisis. Then Thursday at 7 p.m., Dr. Paris Baker will speak at Erie Center for Arts and Technology, and he's presenting on white mothers of Black or biracial children, parenting in the shadow, overlooked, unheard, and disregarded. And then Friday at noon, we will be back in this room for a community conversation with Shatiria Franklin, who will be presenting her organization, which is Destiny of Our Daughters, Empowering the Future and Shaping Future Leaders. So if you would like to join us for any of those programs, or the month full of March in our winter term, please see me or Bailey after tonight's program, and we will get you all signed up. So, finally, introducing our speaker, Diane Chido. Diane, who you may very well know through her frequent publications with us in the wider world, is also one of JES's newest scholars in residence. She is the founder of DC Analytics, a research firm based here in Erie, with over 25 years of experience in supporting post-conflict and fragile societies. And she has recently completed a 3-year contract as Security and Intelligence Policy Advisor for the U.S. Army's Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute. So please join with me in a warm welcome for Diane.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for a rather strange topic. It was nothing I intended to research. I'm working on something else, and this was a random offshoot that came to me in the shower, and I spent a weekend being completely obsessed with it. So my friends will now be happy that I can just tell them they can watch the video so that I can stop talking about it because no one else is interested, so thanks for coming. Okay, let's get right to it. Many authors of the Lost Cause myth. Are we familiar with the Lost Cause myth? Yes? Okay. So at the end of the Civil War, we know the North won the war, we know slavery was ended, and we know ultimately the states came back together into the Union. However, it is often said in the scholarly circles that the South actually won the peace, because the South has managed to kind of take over the narrative of maintaining an emphasis on states' rights, and other kinds of political and social and cultural issues, maintaining the assurance that states are in charge of education, and often even writing textbooks that show that the South was right all along. And we find these things creeping in even into our northern textbooks. So there's a whole other story about this that you can watch on my 2021 video for the Jefferson about the Lost Cause myth, so we won't get too further into it today. But one of the most significant authors was Georgia General Jubal Early, having written extensively about the rebel yell as the voice of the South, in keeping with our theme today. Its origin has been credibly stated to come from an imitation or homage of Native American war cries, also of wolf howls, or as shouts associated with fox hunting, and other animal-related sounds. Many have also suggested a Celtic or Scottish origin. However, this posits that this lumping of all people who may have emigrated from various parts of Britain as Celts has resulted in previous efforts missing what I think is the big tree for a commonly misinterpreted forest. Still others have suggested that it comes from herders calling their animals, but most dismiss this as a charming tale. Charming or not, this is in fact the tale I plan to tell this evening, the true origin of the yell, which I will demonstrate tonight. Many scholars have approached the origin of the rebel yell, then withdrawn from the brink, leaving the reader with the impression that the source is unknowable, essentially giving up the origin to the mists of time. Historians Grady McWhiney, I love his name, I can't say it often enough, and Perry Jameson inaccurately asserted in their book, Attack and Die, Civil War Military Tactics and the Southern Heritage, that the Klan war cry during the Civil War was called the rebel yell, appeared to be another example of the continuity of Celtic warfare. They further cited numerous examples of would-be conquerors' opinions as Celts as savages. They also noted that the continued devotion of Celts to their wild attacks shows that they valued tradition more than success. For more than 2,000 years, they relied almost exclusively upon a single tactic in warfare, the charge, using Culloden as one of these examples. However, the Battle of Culloden took place in the Highlands in 1745, and as I will explain, the so-called Scots-Irish had left Scotland nearly 154 years before the battle and did not take part. The Presbyterian Scots-Irish, unlike their Highland former neighbors, were highly literate. They were not savages, unable to speak actual words. Their fanatical attention to religion required them to be well-schooled in biblical text, and they thrilled at the prospect of polemic religious discussions. They expected their ministers to be expertly trained and highly educated, which is why universities like Princeton were created. There was a shortage of Presbyterian ministers in America when it was founded in 1746 by the Presbyterian Synod. Despite the egregious way in which they inaccurately describe the ethnicity and character of the Confederate soldier, or these Scots-Irish Confederate soldiers on whom we will focus, McWhiney and Jameson actually provided the information needed to crack the case on the rebel yell origin. On the very last page of Attack and Die, the authors gave a report from a contemporary Union soldier who heard the rebel yell in battle, saying, quote, "They emerged from their concealment in the woods and yelling as only the steer drivers of Texas could yell, charged upon our division." The authors continue by noting, quote, "Available evidence suggests that the rebel yell was a variation of traditional Celtic animal calls, especially those used to call cattle and hogs and hunting dogs." Not only does their last footnote in the book not provide the source for these available evidence pieces, they fail to explain who these specific Celts are. By the Civil War, many Scots-Irish had continually moved west from Appalachia, and as I will describe in a very, very far in the future book, unless somebody here would like to fund a sabbatical, their physical presence and many aspects of their culture and military-esque ethos contributed greatly to our long-standing national cowboy myth as rugged individualists mastering the land for free-range farming, when in fact it was pens and barbed wire and railroads that made America the meat-producing capital of the world. This analysis will begin with a catalog of manifestations of the yell and the various suggested origins. Hang on. And then we'll move on to who the Scots-Irish were, why they ended up in America, and how they made their living once they settled in Appalachia. By the end, you will be left to conclude that all signs pointing to it are already apparent, but have simply not been investigated in a way that allows those with a contemporary interest to know the yell's origin. Let's first hear the yell. Maybe. Can everyone using the amplification devices hear that sound? Yes? Could you hear the sound? I think the magic number is channel 4. Is that correct? Ma'am? I don't think everybody's hearing the sound. Okay, it's channel 1. I'm sorry, I'm looking at you. Did you hear the sound? Yes. Okay, you looked like you were looking around like, what's everybody doing? Why are we staring at this picture? I just want to make sure everyone was caught up because there will be more sounds. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Sorry for the delay. Okay, so what we're looking at here is a 1913 photograph at the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. In the darker jackets, you're seeing, of course, Union veterans and then Southern veterans on the other side. Okay, so think about this. It's 1913, okay? The sound you just heard was a 1939 recording. This is the 75th anniversary, okay, of, this gentleman, Thomas Alexander from the 37th North Carolina, recorded many times in 1939 to sound like hundreds of soldiers. Okay, so that's what you would have heard in a battle. But you wouldn't really have heard that in a battle because those men would have been very young and not in their 90s. At the time he was recorded, Alexander was 90 years old. So let's hear him singularly.
Regiment was asked to deliver a rebel battle cry to a local.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thanks to.
All right, so that's the singular sound that you heard recorded many times. Okay, let's go on. Okay, so there have been many other things historically that have been claimed to be the origin of the rebel yell. One of these is wolf howls. Now, in the Appalachian region, the Virginia red wolf was most prevalent in that period, in the period before the Civil War. Unfortunately, it is today extinct except in zoos. However, we will be able to hear a zoo-based red wolf howling. Perhaps similar, but clearly canid, I would say. Then there are lots of sounds that you would hear during fox hunts. You'd hear lots of dogs yapping, of course. You'd hear men shouting, and sometimes women, depending. You would hear horns blowing, whistles, and you would hear lures that were meant to attract the foxes out of their holes. Oh no, sorry. That's not it.
Red Bull gives you wings.
It's coming. We set this up so we wouldn't have to have that happen, but sometimes we wait too long and they throw something in there again. Let me just turn the sound off and play that so we can. Here we go. Definitely not the rebel yell. I have foxes in my neighborhood, and I hear them barking in the spring and fall. They don't sound like that, but they don't sound like the rebel yell either. The next thing that is often suggested is the Native American war cry, most typically from Cherokee. I am not a specialist in Native Americans, but when I did my research, trying to listen to these sounds, which I should point out I did mostly last summer with the windows open, and my husband was very concerned that the neighbors were going to be terrified by all the noises coming out of our house at top volume. So, this is what I have for you. All right, and this is why these are all wrong. Ready? Okay. Okay.
Was that authentic or?
Well, it was current. It was current. It was a demonstration. They were demonstrating a war dance, including sounds. Okay, so to speak again of the lost cause myth, one of the greatest authors, sometimes called the father thereof, was General Jubal Early. If you can't read this, a small excerpt of his writing is, "The Army of the Northern Virginia was never defeated. It merely wore itself out whipping the enemy." Okay. We did hear a recording from Nixon's office at one point where Henry Kissinger said during the Vietnam War, "Mr. President, I believe we will have to redefine the word winning." Well, apparently so did the people in the South at one point. So, the rebel yell is often called the voice of the South. And the reason for this is because the first time it was reported, most widely by General Early, to have been heard during the Civil War was at the 1861 Battle of the First Manassas. This was the first Confederate victory in the Civil War, and it was very powerful in the hagiography of the Civil War itself and to keep people going to remember about that battle. So what happened, according to Jubal Early, was General Stonewall Jackson, who was Scots-Irish, told his troops to charge and at the same time to, quote, "yell like furies." Okay, well, he was not the only one to report this. Early, that is. Actually, let me come back to this. When the Civil War began, these already militant and fiercely independent frontier people were well suited to become soldiers, who, if a bit recalcitrant toward authority, generally fought for their states. Sometimes they fought on the side that didn't attack them first. So there were lots of reasons why people chose to be in favor of the Confederacy or the Union, but many also fought for the side they felt was less likely to have wronged them in the past or would endanger their land ownership or way of life. Thus, many hearkened to the rebel call. As a Scots-Irishman himself, this is how Stonewall Jackson is apparently told his men to shout like furies, but not to issue a singular word nor a regular cry, as Highlanders might, but to use their individual, organically honed and loudest emanations. Okay, so So the 1961 battle was reported upon by the London Times, and the war correspondent who was there was a gentleman named Warren Howard Russell. He recorded the sound of the yell, but not the way Jubal Early did. He said that the Southern troops were very lazy, and when they were told to dig battlements, they refused. And eventually the soldiers, the officers, got tired of prodding them and cajoling them and threatening them, and finally decided that the quote-unquote colored troops would dig the battlements, and they set up a cheer that he says, the whooping and screeching sounds that passed muster in this part of the world for cheers of joy, not some kind of battle cry. But the story spread so quickly and was so interesting to people that Russell decided to capitalize on it. And he reprised his story in 1863, but changed it into a standardized cry that was intentionally meant to be part of the military toolkit to intimidate the enemy. He included one Union soldier account, which actually helps us today, despite his prevarication on what the yell sounded like the first time he heard it. He said it was one continuous shout of mingled voices without any intermission, unisonance, or time. Each man just opened his mouth as wide as he could, strained his voice to the highest pitch, and yelled as long as his breath lasted. This word, unisonance, it lacked a singular sound. It was unique to each man, and that's important for our story. Okay. There are accounts of this sound having been emanated before the Civil War, most primarily in the Battle of Kings Mountain during the War for the Revolution in October of I fixed it on my other slide, 1780, not 1870, sorry. This was during the Revolutionary War. And this This battle's success turned the tide of the war in the Patriots' favor. This is known to have been a really important battle in winning the war against the British, and no one less than General Washington himself said, "If defeated everywhere else, I will make my last stand for liberty among the Scots-Irish," some say he said, or the Ulster Scots, depending on who's reporting it, "of my native Virginia." So we know that it was Virginians of Scots-Irish ancestry who won the Battle of Kings Mountain, and may very well have used their version of some kind of cry while they were charging. The Battle of the Alamo is also often said to be a place where the rebel yell was heard, but this is really dubious. This picture of Davy Crockett with his coonskin cap smiting all and sundry around him is incredibly erroneous. There were a handful of troops. Davy Crockett was in fact Scots-Irish. His troops were defending the fort, and there were very few of them. Credible witness accounts make no mention of any special battle cry, and there's a reason for this. They were attacked in their sleep after midnight, and they were never able to make a charge. They were seen skulking around buildings in the fort, trying to stay alive and unnoticed, so they wouldn't have been making any kind of cry, and they never did make a charge or a stand of any kind by the time the battle ended at 6:30 and Davy Crockett and most of his compatriots were dead. So, the Battle of San Jacinto that took place a month later is the first time we are told that, "Remember the Alamo," was shouted. Sam Houston, who was commanding troops at that time attacking the fort at San Jacinto, may well have used "Remember the Alamo" as a pep talk. But there's no mention of the rebel yell being used, even though Sam Houston himself was also Scots-Irish and many of his troops also were. So we know that an actual phrase was used at San Jacinto, even though some have said that was rebel yell, but even small school children can tell you what was said. All right, so as it had been, so here we go. Sorry, it's really hard. If I don't stick with my notes, we'll be here all night. McWhiney and Jameson's Attack and Die claims the yell was part of the Celtic charge cry, quote, "the horrible and diverse yelling by Celts referred to by Romans." Romans would have mostly heard lowlanders because they were fighting with lowlanders. It is often said, not the Highlanders, that troubled them so much they built a wall to keep them in the Highlands. So the lower wall that you see there, Hadrian's, was begun in AD 122. Roughly sort of showing a dividing line between Scotland and England, but not really because it goes up where you see the approximate border. 20 years later, the Antonine Wall was begun because the Romans had managed to get some semblance of, I wouldn't call it control, but some management of the lowlands, but they couldn't manage the highlands. And they were like, okay, just let those people stay up there and let's block them off. So, as it had been in lowland Scotland than in Northern Ireland, farmers allowed their livestock to range freely in common areas. In the frontier area where the Scots-Irish settled in America, they tended to place their homes in the center of their land, clear space for cultivating cereal and other crops, and leave their livestock to graze in the wilder area of the property. In Scotland, they had done the same, but to protect fattening livestock from the frequent raiding that occurred along that borderland between England and lowland Scotland, which was practiced by border reivers and is practiced anywhere that there are disputed borderlands, wild lands, Wild West kind of situations. Even today, you have this kind of raiding that takes place. You have brigandry. So these border reivers were from both sides of the line. They moved the Scots moved their livestock upland on a seasonal basis. This process was continued in Northern Ireland in a process called bullying. Archibald Haney points out in his The Drove Roads of Scotland that in addition to wintering, moving livestock around in the border regions kept them either safer from thieves or from their real owners in discovering them once they had been taken in the first place. As you see here, cattle and hogs were the preferred quarry for the reivers, as crossing the border to steal livestock, then driving them back was generally done quickly and stealthily, usually at night. Sheep and goats are likely to bleat and blat along the way, but cattle and hogs would be quieter on these so-called hot trods. They were moving fast, they were fully armed, and they needed to be quiet. So don't take the noisy animals. I've had goats. They do blat a lot. So let's be clear on the lowlanders and the highlanders. I love Braveheart. I've probably seen it 5 times, and no offense intended to Mel Gibson, but his costumer should have been replaced. William Wallace defeated the English army at the Battle of Stirling Ridge in 1297. We know this to be true. William Wallace was a lowlander. He was fighting the English to get the lowlands independent from England, what we would call England today. The lowlanders and the highlanders, generally speaking, not to a person, but generally speaking, the lowlanders spoke English. They were not clannish by this period. They didn't wear kilts. They didn't have tartans, unlike the highlanders, who spoke Gaelic, were generally Catholic, and still maintained their clans. As you can see in the picture of the statue, we see William Wallace with all of his body parts still attached, and he would have been wearing chainmail and a simple tunic, no tartan in sight. This is important for us to keep in mind. When you hear Celtic, we can't lump all these groups together because they were very different. By the 17th century, the Lowland Scots no longer lived under a clan system. As James Leyburn, who was the foremost chronicler of the Scots-Irish in America, put it, they were not clansmen who wore kilts and who marched complete with dirk, sparran, brooch, and bonnet to the skirling of bagpipes in the glens. On the contrary, they were farmers who eked out a bare living on thin soil as a tenant or a laird, a landowner. In his 2012 book on the rebel yell as an enduring cultural symbol, Dr. Craig Warren, who some of you may know, he's a history professor at Barrand, he correctly pointed out that Scottish war cries, rather than being horrible and diverse yelling, were typically a verbal call, not simply an auditory one. This would typically consist of the name of their clan chief or that of the land to be conquered, or a response to the insult they were fighting over in the Highlands. As Tom Dolan described in his sketch on Highland warfare, ancient Celts often had battle horns to scare the enemy, and later bagpipes. But it was the battle cry which often got one's blood boiling and tied the clansmen together in unison. It became a shared experience. Battle cries differed from clan to clan. Often it was the name of a place, a leader, or a previously well-known and inspirational warrior. During the 45, Lord Murray, commanding the Scottish troops, used to scream, "Claymore!" as he drew his sword and led his men to battle. This 45 to which Dolan refers, again, is the 1745 Battle of Culloden that ended the Jacobite insurrection, after which Britain firmly established control over the Highlands, prohibiting the wearing of clan tartans and the possession of firearms. Fans of the series Outlander will be familiar with this story. It also ushered in the period of the enclosures, in which traditionally common grazing land was fenced in order to establish large-scale sheep farming. This is an important point, as it reinforces our understanding that Scots traditionally grazed their livestock free range at a time when migrants began leaving for the Northern Ireland plantation. So, as Henry James Ford explained in his The Scots-Irish in America, Colonial History, 1600 to 1775, the planting of trusty colonies among uncivilized peoples as garrisons to check their insubordination and as centers from which culture would be diffused was a practice that went back to the times of the ancient Roman Commonwealth and had been adopted by many European rulers and was generally regarded as a well-settled expedient of prudent statesmanship. Today in the United States, we have a very different understanding of the term plantation, which is why, all the way in 2020, Rhode Island changed its name from Rhode Island and the Providence Plantation to just plain Rhode Island. Apparently it took them a while to realize that we have a different connotation in America. So this was a normal practice. I don't want to get too deeply into the ancient history of all of this. Wait for the book. But in the late 15th century, or 17th, no, I'm sorry, in the late 1500s, the Crown had been fighting for generations to try to subdue Ireland. And it was unable to do so until around early 1600s, through land grabs, legal means, police actions, and battles, it was able to remove a number of powerful landowners and clan leaders we called earls. And they got them to leave their land along with most of their fighters and their people, which left, quote unquote, empty land. We all know how much empty land there was in the Americas. Same sort of concept. They knew if they didn't fill that land with the right sort of people, the wrong sort of people would be back. So back to our chart about the Highlanders and Lowlanders. You couldn't possibly allow Highlanders to show up. They were just as bad as the savage Irish who were Catholic and spoke Gaelic. We couldn't have them there. So they invited proper English Anglicans to come and farm, as well as Lowlanders who, although not Anglicans, at least they were Protestant and they spoke English and they could cope with them. For the Lowland Scots, this was a great deal because they were offered 50-year very cheap leases on land. And their land was pretty overfarmed, it was sparse, it was getting to be overcrowded. And if they didn't like it there, they could always just come right home. It was a short boat ride. So they agreed to come in large numbers. Typically, a whole congregation would pick up and move, or an extended family. And they were expected to serve as a bulwark against the native savages. Again, sound familiar? So when they moved to Northern Ireland in 1609, they were going to check it out. Everything went really well for those first 50 years. You have to understand, if you have a cheap lease that can't be raised, where the price can't be raised for 50 years, that means that you, your sons, maybe even your grandsons, can really make a good living, improving the land, building outbuildings, growing your flocks, that sort of thing, and nobody can take it away from you, and you can afford it, and it's something that's reasonable that you can manage for a long time. Unfortunately, after the 50 years, people started raising most of the people who actually owned the land where they were tenant farmers were in London. And they started raising the rents 2 or 3 times to the point where people couldn't afford to pay anymore. There were a number of bad harvests and bad crop years. There were a lot of things that happened. And in addition to this, there were ebbs and flows of the toleration of Presbyterianism within this period. And whenever they were feeling particularly oppressed, they started talking about leaving, potentially going back to Scotland, but also going further afield. The first attempt to cross the North Atlantic and go to North America was in 1636 on a ship called the Eagle's Wing. When congregation tried to go, and they struck so many storms and dangerous conditions, they had to turn around and come back. Nobody really tried again for almost another 50 years, but by the 1690s, the boat technology had improved and navigation had improved so that it was less of a daunting idea to cross the North Atlantic and go to the new land in America. So so that started taking place in earnest in the 1718, when a number of congregations were invited. One congregation specifically was invited to come by no less than Cotton Mather himself to join the Puritans in Massachusetts. Unfortunately, his invitation was so well received, they didn't just have one boat, but 4 came. And the Puritans started freaking out that they were going to come and eat all the food and they were all going to starve through the winter. So they politely invited them to move to undeveloped land 60 miles away in what's now Worcester, Massachusetts. So they had to take this horrible long walk with all their stuff as soon as they got off the boats. And anyway, people started coming through New England, eventually through New York, through Philadelphia, in larger and larger numbers. And we believe that by the beginning of the Independence War, at least 250,000 of them came from Ulster directly. Now understand that we didn't have a way to track who people were until 1819 with the Steerage Act. So if you embarked from Belfast, You were either considered to be British, English, something like that, who cares, or Irish because you came from Ireland. Whereas what we call today the Scots-Irish never really considered themselves to be Irish, even though they had been in Ireland for almost 100 years. They still considered themselves Scots, but no one else did. So this is an American invention of a name. They're often actually called the people with no name. But we call them Scots-Irish today as a convention. Okay. Because the Scots-Irish were generally relegated to the frontier, as they had been in Ulster, in Northern Ireland, they brought with them all the survival skills that they needed: building, hewing, sewing, fighting. They fought against the native peoples in the areas where they migrated, and they also learned from them. As Rory Fitzpatrick described them in God's Frontiersmen, it's no wonder that St. Louis Republic's editor would describe them as the men as red Tennesseans. The future generations would assume that the rebel yell derived from an initiation or homage to native war cries. In terms of the rebels relying on the charge in battle, it was true. It was often true because they lacked ammunition and would not be able to repel Union charges, and often had to rely on nothing much more than bayonets, hand-to-hand combat, the element of surprise, and the fear inspired by the use of the haunting, cacophonous rebel yell. So you can see here, I'm going to step in front of the thing here. Okay, so the darker colored brown is where the Scots-Irish lived. The lighter, pale, almost yellow, is where Germans lived. So Germans and Scots-Irish were invited by William Penn to populate Pennsylvania. He had been given that tract of land for 10 years, but had to show that it was being improved and could be taxed. So he had to have people living on it who could work it. So he went out and sent his land agents out to bring people from those two places. And you can see how the Germans and the Scots-Irish mixed in a few areas, but they generally kept to themselves. They were both Calvinist Presbyterians, but they spoke different languages. They practiced their religion differently, and they also farmed differently. You can tell the Scots-Irish settlements, and you can watch the settlement pattern through Appalachia by following the dates of Presbyterian churches and when they were formed. You can also follow the fields where stumps were left behind, because the Scots-Irish didn't do anything that they didn't think profited them in time or money, so they left the stumps. And it's actually funny, if you watch the Schoolhouse Rock video of the preamble, they show log cabins with stumps all around them. So I thought that's pretty accurate. The Germans, of course, cleared the land to the letter and planted in precise rows. So the Scots-Irish actually preferred piney woods. They would often not take the best land, and the Germans would just sit there and go, but the really good land is over. Okay, see you later, you enjoy, have a good time. But the Scots-Irish preferred the piney woods with plenty of free food for their livestock. So you can see the pattern of migration. Scots-Irish tended to not like to have a lot of neighbors. So even when family would move nearby, they felt they needed like a mile of elbow room, and they would keep going. So they're often referred to in the literature as having been nomadic. And in fact, they dispersed throughout the South and the West. And as Jim Webb says in his book, Born Fighting, his Scots-Irish family dispersed all the way to California and Hawaii at the lead up to World War II for jobs in the factories, the munitions factories and things. So you find them everywhere now. But let's see, where are we? So Labour related that customarily, at least until the Tennessee front was reached, westward and southward migration was not a generalized movement of the whole Scots-Irish population, with existing frontiersmen sort of leading the way. Rather, the latest arrivals moved furthest out on the frontier. The best land was already taken along the coasts by the people who were there already, and they didn't really want them with their no shoes having and their ways being in town. They gave them the land on the frontier and expected them, just like the British did, to be a bulwark against the native peoples. And when the Scots-Irish looked out at native hunting grounds, they said, well, God gave us this land and nobody's using it, so let's get on move and take it for ourselves. So that caused a lot of conflict, as you can imagine. The Highland Scots, when they finally started coming in larger numbers after 1745, followed a different pattern. They went to the interior of North Carolina, just like an outlander. And they also liked to be in cities where they could serve as merchants, because remember, these were large landowners who were nobility, and they brought their families, their tenants, and their wealth with them. So we look at southern Appalachian area. The blue area, the valley and ridge, is what we're really focused on. The soil here was poorly drained with low permeability and slow runoff. And this is where we find the piney woods, which are ideal for woodland and not great for farming, except really, really good for livestock. So this brings us to the point where land value was often estimated, not by the value of the lumber per se, but by the amount of forage the forest could provide for livestock. What kind of livestock like to forage? Pigs. Okay, so this was the map that was the evidence that I found absolutely compelling. The density of hog raising in 1840, illustrated by the map, shows a higher concentration of hogs only in the corn belt of the Old Northwest. Excuse me. Then in Appalachia. Note on this map, each dot represents 2,000 swine. So when you see the density, you're talking serious density of hogs. In the Northwest, hogs were mainly grown for market and ended up in Cincinnati for domestic or export markets, or Chicago. Their hogs on large-scale farms would have been penned, and their owners would have had little reason to train them to come when called. As corn was also a predominant crop in the region, it would have been economical to feed it to hogs to fatten them for market. The next highest concentration shows the clear swath along the Appalachian region where they were consumed on site or sold in nearby markets, not for export. S.B. Hilliard provided astounding evidence of the preponderance of hog raising among the hill people along the spine of Appalachia and pork consumption across the South in the antebellum period. The title of the 5th chapter of his book, Hog Meat and Hoe Cake, emphasizes this with the title, Pork, the South's First Choice. He noted that most southern states ranked among the highest in the nation throughout the antebellum period and were matched only by New York, Pennsylvania, and the Corn Belt states of the Old Northwest. All areas where the Scots-Irish settled in less developed areas. He further asserted that nowhere in the nation at any time have swine ever reached the importance in regional dietary resources than they did in the South during the 3 or 4 decades prior to the Civil War. Hilliard wrapped up this chapter in Hog Meat and Hoe Cake with the statement, quote, "Finally, when we consider the huge surpluses produced in the hill states of Tennessee and Kentucky, then in the traditional interpretations of Southern dependence upon the Old Northwest are further undermined." These were 2 very separate economies. The report of an eyewitness account from an 1850 Patent Office report further described the widespread open-range raising of hogs. The Celtic herdsman's way, quote, required little expenditure of either labor or money. Think of how we think about hillbillies or rednecks today. Just kind of sitting on their porch, spitting, surrounded by stumps, this sort of thing, right? In many areas of the South, natural vegetation was so abundant that, as one contemporary noted, quote, "We raise our hogs by allowing them to range in our woods where they get fat on acorns," insisted a South Carolinian. Hilliard also reported the account of James Stewart in 1883, quote, "Hogs are very generally allowed to feed on the nuts in the woods. The climate is so mild during the winter that they're allowed to roam about during the whole year, feed on nuts, acorns, etc., which are very abundant in the woods of this country and occasionally on fallen fruit." Hilliard noted that, quote, "lack of fences and the practice of allowing feeder pigs to forage for mast in the forests where they mingled with the neighbor's swine," think about the trial in the Hatfields and McCoys, "or perhaps some feral stock, made spaying necessary to protect one's feeder stock." I never imagined that sows were spayed all the way back then, but apparently they were. In the sense of brood sows, however, the grower faced a more difficult problem. Since he could not spay brood sows, he was forced to pen them until they were bred to his preferred boar. Otherwise, quote, "they took to the woods to mate with some long-tusked, long-nosed paramour of the piney woods." Can't have that. Another South Carolinian who owned a farm in Lowndes County, Mississippi, noted that he generally fattened hogs on corn before market, saying, quote, "I made a good corn crop and I have plenty of hogs to make pork for the plantation if I can get them up. But they're scattered very bad at this time in consequence of the acorns, which is plenty this year." How will he get these scattered hogs up? By calling them, of course. In America, and especially in Appalachia, they raised some cattle, but mainly hogs, because they grew well foraging on their own. In order to keep track of their wild-raised hogs, each family made a unique marking on each hog's ear. When it was time to butcher them, no one wanted to spend days or weeks hunting for their hogs, so they trained them at a young age with salt licks and corn to come when they were called. Further evidence of this need to call is that legislation only began permitting limited enclosures in 1858 in Virginia, mainly enforced only in the more urban areas, with one source noting tellingly that those in favor of enclosure referred to those opposed to enclosure as pig-headed. Thus, it is not surprising that the Northerners who heard the yell were shocked and horrified by the unfamiliar sound. By the time of the Civil War, the North was heavily populated with increasing numbers of residents living in cities. On his 1835 visit to New York City, no less a personage than Charles Dickens lamented the disgusting smells and sights of a city of trash and manure, noting the pigs. On a stroll down Broadway, Dickens came upon, quote, "a solitary swine lounging homeward by himself. The hog led a roving, gentlemanly vagabond kind of life, a truly Republican pig, in every respect, going wherever he pleases." Mind you, that was Charles Dickens, not me. Pigs were no joking matter, though. Dickens' porker and about 3,000 fellow, quote, "ugly brutes," unquote, were the city scavengers, and like the seagulls that flock today's garbage dumps, they had license to consume the tons of garbage dumped by residents and businesses on the city's docks and thoroughfares. In earlier years, when the municipal authorities attempted to control unpenned pigs, riots had erupted, for any curtailing of the freedom of these animals increased the cost of their upkeep, thus placing a significant burden on the poor who owned them. It would not be until the cholera epidemic of 1849 that the city's sanitary commission was able to, quote, "board out thousands of swine to the sparsely developed northern wards. These pigs may have roamed, but not as far as they could in the hollers of Appalachia for weeks or months, and they knew their own short way home on the city streets and didn't need to be called." Another item that I discovered in my research that really astounded me about this is the Old English word for acorn. Every culture has a bread, their staple food. So the staple for pigs, or the bread for pigs, is is pig bread. We use the word acorn that we learned from Old Germanic, which the Germans brought. The word for acorn, comes from the word acre. So again, you could measure your land and potentially its value based on how many acorns or other kinds of forage were on it. But this is how we have this for the Old English. So, as I mentioned, as several authors have noted, the sounds made to form the yell were not standardized as in a verbal war cry, further asserting that the high pitch was the only common denominator. As Dr. Warren described it, quote, "the dissonant and overlapping noises united to form a single voice, a sonic effect emblematic of a white South that might appear outwardly monolithic, but in truth contained a great diversity of backgrounds, regions, aptitudes, and beliefs," unquote. In the valleys and ridges of the Appalachian region, sound traveled farthest when it was higher pitched. To ensure it carried as far as the hogs may have wandered, so hog calls developed with these kinds of sounds as loud and shrill as possible. Each family would have its own unique call for its hogs. That the yell was singular to a man suggests that while there may have been some attempts at unifying the sound within regiments once they had all heard each other's during the war and recognized its power as a weapon, these soldiers knew whence it originated, on their own farms. Just as children recognize their mother's voice, individual pig passels know their master's call. thus the lack of uniformity in the sound of the rebel yell. Modern hog calling contests show the diversity of emanations used for a unitary purpose, with calls to specific hog passels as unique as their brands. Let's hear a modern hog calling champion and compare his call, minus the piggy, piggy, piggy part, and then recall its similarity to the rebel yell recording. You be the judge. I want to take this out and I want to show you the hog calling because it's much more fun that way. Let's go here. This is our friend Chris Carr, the 2015 Iowa State hog calling champion. He's from Illinois, as you might note from his hat. We'll skip that part. And let's recall the rebel yell by a 90-year-old man.
Was asked to deliver his rendition of the rebel battle cry.
I rest my case. Thank you very much for sticking through it. I have a lot of information and I had to follow my notes or else I would have kept you here all night. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions?
I don't know why you'd want to know more about this topic, but any questions are certainly welcome. Please, George. Oh, I've been dreading this all day. Please, George.
What did you farm?
Just a little bit about if you've discovered anything about uniformity. You know, you mentioned and went through the individual calls that the different farms would have, and when they all got together in a regiment or even a company, did you find anything about them conforming to each other, or how did that develop?
I will throw myself and Dr. Craig Warren under the bus because when I came up with this thought about the pigs and the hog calling and the whatever made me start thinking about this, I raced to Barron to get his book called The Rebel Yell, published in 2012. And I opened up the chapter called The Origins, and it was left hanging. And I went, what? He published this whole book. Dr. Warren is a literary historian. He was interested in the Rebel Yell as an enduring cultural symbol. Rebel Yell whiskey, the Rebel Yell song, things like this. His interest was not in the history of the origin. I will also say for myself, my interest was not in the origin, it was in the Scots-Irish. This was a project that kind of, you are in the rabbit hole right now. This is the detour that I took. So I cannot say that I did any kind of additional research to determine what happened after figuring out, I think, where it came from. I didn't go through, and we only have these sparse recordings and they're made so much later. We don't really have a way to say, oh, this one sounded like this. Oh, the North Carolinians added this little extra bit to it. Because again, the recordings are so sparse. Now, there are a number of sources that attempt to describe the yell. And they describe it at certain battles, so you can deduce from there who was using it. But that's a whole lot more information, and I did not get enough from the syllabic descriptions to be able to say, oh, by 1863 we had a unified sound, and it was based on the, North Carolina 37 or whatever, So I don't have an answer for you. Judy?
Diane, do you know whether there are multitudes of pigs in the Appalachian area now that would be the survivors?
I would suggest there probably are many generations past. I mean, think about Florida. They have a serious boar population there, and even cute little Wilbur-type pigs that have been hand-fed and raised Once they're loose for a few months, they actually will, you will see their faces elongate, the males will develop tusks, their fur will start to grow, and they become looking like they've been there for generations. So I would assume that, yes, there definitely are those long-tusked paramours. All right, you've all had enough of hog calling. I can understand that. Have a good night. Thank you so much.
Give her another round of applause.